I was born on the 10th of November 1925 in Chicago, Illinois. And my schooling, other than grammar and middle and high school, was the University of Maryland for baccalaureate and the master's degree at Hood College.
Your birthday again?
Sir?
Your
10 November 25.
10
November 1925.
25. And I know that you are the chairman, the president of Korean War Memorial Foundation. Would
Yes,
you please?
I'm the chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation.
Would you please explain about what this foundation does and how you build up?
Yeah, the foundation is a byproduct of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Advisory Board, which was appointed by President Reagan and given the mission of selecting a site, selecting a design, raising the necessary funds to construct the memorial, and dedicating the memorial. Following the dedication of the memorial on 27 July 1995, those of us who were members of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Advisory Board decided to form a foundation whose principal function would be twofold. One, to raise funds to ensure the proper perpetual maintenance of the memorial, and two, to educate the American public about the Korean War, both its ferocity and the importance it played in world history in the 20th century.
So I heard that there is a statue that has model from you. Can you talk about that?
You mean in the line of sculptures?
Yes.
Yes, that originated because the sculptor, Frank Gaylord, that was selected by the board to do the 19 statues, he was a compatriot in a sense of the word. We were both paratroopers in World War II, but in different divisions, so we had an immediate rapport. And one of the problems that Mr. Gaylord had was those of us on the advisory board instructed him that the facial features of the 19 sculptures in the formation had to be representative of the ethnic and racial derivation of the United States Armed Forces during the time of the war, and at an average age of between 20 and 25. Obviously...
Only Army?
No, all services.
Military, right? Yeah.
There was Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force. And of course the ethnic derivations were Caucasian, African American, Oriental American, and Hispanic. So obviously he needed to have some differentiation in the facial features in order to be realistic in his sculpture. So he asked several of us on the board to give him pictures of ourselves when we were at age 25, which is the age I was at during the Korean War, because I'd also served in World War II. And he used those photos as a way of creating the facial features of the sculptures that were involved. And altogether he used 5 of us from the board in that design feature. I happen to be one that's number 16 in the column. And he used me also to have a metamorphical message and a subliminal message. I'm the only one in the column who is directly facing the mural wall, so as to emphasize the relationship between the combat element and the mural wall, and the reflection of the 19 sculptures in the wall to give the viewing public the image of 38, symbolic of the 38th parallel. So Yes, it's not something that's known. It's not publicized. The only people who are aware of that relationship are those of us who were participants. There's nothing recorded about it, okay? It's not in history. It's an anecdote shared by those of us who were on the board and our families. But the general public has no knowledge of that, nor was it intended that they do.
So it's exclusive for this interview.
Sir?
So this is exclusive for this interview.
Yes.
But you telling me about this?
Yeah, well, yeah, or anybody else that asks. But, you know, it is it's sort of a singular honor, and on the base, the underneath of the base of that particular sculpture, my name is engraved on it. Mm. So should the day ever come when they pull them up, they look on the bottom, they'd find it, as well as the others, of course. I'm not unique in that regard. But I seriously doubt that's going to happen, you know. It's something known to myself and my family, and as we die, so too will that knowledge.
So you said it was in 1995, and why is it so late that, you know, the Korean War veterans have their own memorial park? Since the war ended in 1953.
Well,
why did it take so long to have it?
Literally, because it truly is a forgotten war. I mean, it is in the 20th century of American history, is just barely worth 3 paragraphs, and 2 of them are devoted to the Truman-MacArthur political controversy. The Korean War is in an odd place in history, American history, because it came, relatively speaking, so soon after World War II. It was a war that did not involve a major proportion of our population. Most of our population were living a very good life in 1950. The economy had recovered. The veterans from World War II had returned to their hometown and communities. They were going to school. They were building homes, starting their families. And the number of people that we took from our society to enter the armed forces, either voluntarily or through the draft, was so small in number, according to our population at the time. It was just under 200 million. So most communities were really not aware of the fact that such a small number of their young men had disappeared. In fact, there's a saying that's common amongst Korean veterans that when they came back from Korea, if they came back okay, they went back to their hometown, people who knew them would say, hey, where you been? Been on vacation? Or, you know, we didn't know, what have you been doing with yourself? They had no idea that they had gone to war. And they certainly had no idea of the nature of that war, more akin to World War I than World War II in its ferocity and in its casualty producing. And, you know, those of us who are old soldiers have a favorite saying. If you ever wanted to pick a place in the world to have a war, it would not be Korea. Mm. And of course, a lot of things that, again, history has forgotten, American history. Korea in 1950 was, in so many respects, almost a medieval country as far as its infrastructure was concerned. It had no major road or rail networks. The great bulk of its population still lived a peasantry type of existence. And the developed areas or industrial areas were primarily in the north. And of course, this is a direct result of the fact that most of the raw materials were in the north, and it was essential, of course, you know, because of the transportation difficulties, to establish the industries that took advantage of those raw materials as close to the source as possible. When the Japanese took over Korea in 1910, they in effect made it a slave-dominated country. essentially a prefecture of Japan, but far from it in terms of the way the Japanese infrastructure treated the Korean people. And while it would be incorrect to say that they enslaved them, it was close to that, okay? Of course, the Japanese, like any other people, depended upon the infrastructure of Korea to help manage the country and its people. So they had to take advantage of the Korean system and traditions and history to keep the people in check, so to speak, and to maximize their productivity for Japanese militarism.
Yeah. I know that you are working on another big project, Wall of Remembrance.
Yes.
Would you please talk about that?
Yes. This has its genesis in the law which authorized the Korean War Veterans Memorial, which is Public Law 99-572. And in the preamble of that law, the Congress hyphenated and personalized a phrase that says the purpose of the memorial to honor those of the American Armed Forces who served in Korea, particularly those who were killed in action, missing in action, or prisoners of war. That phrase was emphasized. So clearly one could conclude, and it's not an assumption, it's a fact, that the Congress intended that memorial specifically honor those who were killed in action, missing in action, or prisoners of war. To execute the law instructed the president to appoint a Korean War Veterans Memorial Advisory Board composed of people who were veterans of the Korean War, and gave that board the mission of complying with the law. In other words, selecting a site, selecting a design, raising the funds, getting the memorial constructed, and dedicating it. Those of us, 12 of us that were appointed to the board, ranged in rank from four-star generals down to people who were basically soldiers and had gone back to civilian life, but were occupying some positions of importance. Like, for example, Jack Curcio was the president of Mack Motors. One of our other gentlemen was the CEO of Occidental Petroleum, and so forth. A third one was the Midwestern director of the American Legion. So there were people of successful people, in other words, who had made of their lives a success. Those of us who were career military personnel who were appointed to the board consisted of General Stilwell, who was a four-star Army general, General Davis, who was a four-star Marine general, a Medal of Honor recipient, and then people such as myself, whose career had got us to the grade of colonel and had spanned, in my case, almost 38 years. But we were a diverse group. There's no question about that. There was a great deal of independent thinking in the group. And we all had very specific parameters that we thought the memorial should encompass. All of us were motivated by that phraseology in the law, which I quoted earlier, that to honor those killed in action, missing in action, or prisoners of war. We initiated a nationwide design competition and offered individuals, architects, artists, what have you, to submit a proposed design that complied with that portion of the law that I had earlier emphasized. We received in excess of 500 submissions. And over a period of a month, the 12 of us evaluated those 500 and were simply disappointed in the fact that none of them met what we felt were the requirements that had been imposed when the design competition was announced. In desperation, we finally selected 3 that were the favorites of minority of members of the board, each 3. It was no one design had a majority of the boards that favored it. Basically, we had 3 designs, 4 people each pushed them. Obviously not a majority. That required some very hard soul searching on the part of the board members to reduce the 3 to 1 and to hopefully select one that could, with some artful architectural manipulation, produce a design that we felt would answer the requirements of the law and also provide a memorial that was not only dignified but contained, in addition to a subliminal message, a specific message in accordance with the law. That encompassed almost 3 years of back and forth manipulation, changes. It was along the borders process. And in Washington, D.C., if you're attempting to build anything on the Grand Mall, there are a plethora of quasi-governmental agencies that must approve it. For example, the National Capital Planning Commission, the National Capital Memorial Commission, the Fine Arts Commission, then. And each of these, in sequence, leading up to the Fine Arts Commission, had the capability to exert a great deal of influence on the design that the board had submitted for consideration. That, as you might expect, produced a great many changes. And satisfying the bureaucratic needs vis-a-vis the artistic desires, vis-a-vis the emotional desires of the board members, was a laborious and time-consuming process, the end result of which was no one was 100% satisfied. Okay, there was a great deal of give and take, obviously, because you're dealing with a bureaucracy and their appointees. They profess to be experts in art and experts in memorials on the Grand Mall. I'm not too sure what it is that qualifies them as such, but that's why they were appointed to those commissions. Obviously, their impressions, their wishes, their needs, their desires differed considerably from those of us who were on the board. We were not architectural experts. We were not art experts. We were simply people whose emotions were heavily involved in what we thought should be done to honor what basically were the veterans of a forgotten war. Make an awful long story short, after a process of a great deal of give and take, the final result was the memorial as it exists today. What was denied to us was a wall of remembrance. In other words, a name wall of the 36,574 men.
Could you repeat 36?
36,574.
574.
Right, and 103,823 wounded.
Uh-huh.
And over 7,000 still missing in action. 5,800 who were prisoners of war, 52% of whom are still listed as missing. Okay. Reducing that down to simplistic figures and averaging it out, the Korean War cost the American people 1,000 dead and 3,000 wounded every month for 36 months.
Wow.
In a war on a peninsula that was 160 miles wide, in the area where the bulk of the war was fought, within 100 miles of the 38th parallel, either way. Now, at the height of the war, there were 500,000 American, ROK, and UN forces opposed to 1.2 million North Korean and Chinese forces on a 160-mile frontage, okay? In military parlance, counting 8th Army and Korea's Field Army, we had what in American military parlance we call an Army group. And an Army group consists of 2 or more field armies, okay? And a field army consists of 3 corps on an average, each corps having 2 divisions, okay? Now, if one were to compare Korea with any theater of war in World War II on the basis of a field army frontage, Army group frontage of 160 miles, you will not find any battle or campaign in World War II where an Army group confronted that many enemy on a 160-mile frontage, okay? So that is a factor, an element of the war that totally lost to the American people and American history. They don't see it that way. Most of them don't understand that World War II was really 5 separate wars. Okay? You had the China-Burma-India Theater, you had the Pacific Theater, you had the Southwest Pacific Theater, you had the Mediterranean Italian Theater, and after June of 1944, the European Theater. Now, if one excludes the losses of Air Force personnel, which are horrendous, over 20,000 dead, okay? If you exclude that, because there's no comparable in the Korean War, and if you just look at the land engagements, nowhere in any theater of World War II was an American Army group confronted with over 1,250,000 enemy soldiers in a 160-mile frontage. The major campaign in Europe was the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans committed 295,000 troops to that on a frontage of almost 300 miles. The major battle in the Pacific was Okinawa. The Japanese had 175,000 troops there on the entire island of Okinawa. We put in a corps, Marine Division and Army Division, okay? And nowhere in those other battles I mentioned was the rate of casualties equivalent to that of Korea. If you were a soldier, airman, Marine in Korea, you stood 1 chance in 9 of being killed and wounded. If you were in World War II, you stood 1 chance in 12 of being killed and wounded. And if you were in the Vietnam War, you stood one chance in 17 of being killed or wounded. Now, the only other war that one could compare with it in the 20th century would be World War I. But its duration was less than a year for American forces. And even then, the ratio of killed or wounded to the total soldiery deployed was 1 in 22. Now, those data, those statistics are lost in American history insofar as what we teach our children, what we commit to the record, okay? It is one of the reasons why the Korean War is the forgotten war, or more properly, the unknown war, okay? And yet, the ferocity of that war is not something of which our people are aware. Therefore, our desire to add a wall of remembrance to the Korean War Veterans Memorial is to finally give substance to what the Congress directed, to give acknowledgement of those who fell in battle or were wounded or missing in action. Okay. That adds a wall. There is a major objection to another wall on the mall by the agencies that have the ability to frustrate that and to cause it to not happen. They claim, that the pool of remembrance provides a subliminal message that caused visitors to the memorial to take into account the cost of the war. Well, that's totally false because, number one, that subliminal message is too subtle, okay? It is lost on people. They don't relate the pool of water to dead, to missing, to wounded. That was the intent of it, to have a place where you would have contemplative thinking about those who sacrificed. Because the theme of the memorial is freedom is not free. Well, if freedom is not free, what's the cost? The cost, of course, is in terms of the lives of the soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors, etc., that fought the war. As I said, that subliminal message is too subtle. It's not understood. People who visit the memorial do not encircle the pool because there was no reason to do so. There's nothing that attracts them. It doesn't grab them. And even worse, during the winter months, 4 months of the year, the pool is drained. So this so-called mesmerizing pool of water that's supposed to engender thoughts doesn't even exist. So it fails, the pool of remembrance fails in its mission. However, if we get the wall built, that will attract traffic, obviously. People will now encircle that area. And the combination of the names on the wall and the calm, reflective waters of the pool will produce the thought processes, hopefully, that will make people begin to appreciate what the cost of freedom is not free really was. Now, the Park Service, the Department of Interior, and other so-called experts claim that we're building a new memorial. It's an asinine claim. We're not building a new memorial, we're completing an existing one. They say, well, once a memorial is dedicated, it's complete. Excuse me? The Vietnam Memorial was dedicated, and subsequently we added 3 sculptures to it, and then even later, a nurse's memorial. Why? Because the Vietnam Memorial by and of itself, just the names on the wall, did not appropriately honor those Americans who fought in Vietnam. Yes, it was a beautiful honor to the dead, But what about those who served and came home? A war encompasses all those elements, not just the people killed. The Korean Memorial is a magnificent work of art. There is no question about that. But that's how people see it. They see it as a work of art. They do not see it as a memorial. The message is not conveyed to them. Yeah, there are numbers engraved at foot level in granite in the little alcove where the wall has "freedom is not free." But the traffic pattern of the memorial is such. If 4 or 5 people are in there, nobody else can get in. So most people come up one side, pause at the flagpole, take pictures down the line of the memorial, and go down the other walkway and out. That's what they take home with them as the Korean War Memorial. And nowhere are they exposed to the message. Is what cost is there to freedom is not free?
You must be so frustrated about this bureaucracy and other arguments to oppose to erect this wall of remembrance. How do you deal with this frustration? Tell me the soft side of you about the wall of remembrance.
You could probably tell by the emotion I've expressed already. It frustrates me. I mean, I find it so difficult to comprehend. Am I the only one who sees it that way? Of course not. You know, I mean, I can't be a voice in the wilderness on this. There must be millions of other people that feel and see it the same way I do. But the bureaucracy doesn't. And they have the ability to stop it. They can kill, and they have killed it. I have really no more optimism that we will be successful in having H.R. 318 enacted by the Congress this year. And when the 113th Congress adjourns Senate Day on 3 January 2016, so too will die H.R. 318, as did H.R. 2563 in the 112th Congress, okay? And I'm uncertain as to whether at my age and the encroaching limitations of physical agility that comes with the age and the double amputation, whether I have the energy to try again. And I feel that even if we do, we'll wind up in the same position. We'll have 50 or 60 congressmen who will co-support it, but the rest of them will not know about it. There's no way to get them to understand it, to comprehend why we need them. Our only hope this year, because it's an election year, is that Korean War veterans will get, an expression we use, get on the stump, and confront their congressmen in their home districts when they go back home to campaign to be reelected. And they literally confront them like this, you want my vote, I want your vote on H.R. 318. Get it passed, and I'll help you get reelected. If you don't, I'm going to vote for the other guy.
Why can't we have sort of a kind of mobilization of the Korean War veterans and their families to make it happening? Does KWVA...
We don't have the resources to reach them. The only media that reaches Korean War veterans is the Graybeards from the Korean War Veterans Association, and it only has 14,000 plus members. There are 2.3 million Korean veterans in the United States, okay? That doesn't include the Korean defense veterans who served subsequent to September 1954 and whose service ought to and will also be recognized on that wall, okay? Because the war is still going on. It's not there's no peace treaty. There's no end to it. The United States is not even a signatory to a peace. The United States is simply a part of the United Nations that agreed to a ceasefire. So the concept of a peace treaty per se is probably diplomatically impossible. So we have this sort of never land that a state of, it's not even it can't be called a war, an armed conflict. It is a war, but I mean, it can't be defined as such because a war is declared. Nothing was declared, so it's an armed conflict. That exists and will continue to exist until or unless the United Nations and North Korea sign a peace treaty. And that's never happened before in the history of the world. The United Nations has never signed a peace treaty with another nation. So, and you know, when you stop and say United Nations, you're only talking about 26 out of almost 200 now. So we're in sort of a bureaucratic conundrum. There's no way to resolve what happened on the 27th of July, 1953. It's an enigma. And nobody really cares. Nobody's trying to put an end to it. Let me caveat that. Clearly, the people and the leadership of South Korea want a resolution of it, you know. I mean, there is no hope whatsoever to unify Korea as long as the dichotomy exists of 27 July 1953, okay? Somehow that has to be resolved before an even remote process of trying to unify Korea can begin. Because the essence that is North Korea is basically a military element. I don't believe that Kim Jong-il is really running Korea, and I don't believe that the people of North Korea have the faintest damn idea that they're being denied the opportunity to unify with their brothers and sisters from the South by a military that wants to preserve itself. Why does the North Korean, why do they need a 1 million-man army? I mean, do they really think South Korea is going to invade them? That's so far from being realistic, it's like a fairy tale. So why do they need that kind of an army? Well, they don't, but those people who run that army live good on the backs of the peasantry in North Korea. They don't want to change that. They're going to perpetuate it. There's been, 6 generations that have benefited from that kind of a philosophy in North Korea. So, there's no way that even the South Koreans can reach the people of North Korea. And I don't believe anybody has the faintest damn idea of what the people of North Korea want. Because there's no way to reach them. And there's no way for them to express themselves. So, the world has allowed this to continue because we have failed to make it important for the Democratic Republic of China to put an end to the BS of North Korea. Okay? In other words, somehow we've got to be able to convince the Chinese that they don't have to fear a democratic society on the Yalu River. Okay? That the two can exist or coexist as they do now, for all practical purposes. It won't change one iota if Korea becomes unified and the Yalu River becomes the boundary between Manchuria and Korea and Russia, the Russian Republic. Nothing's going to change, except the Korean people, as a unified people, will be able to reach their full potential.
It's really hard to put it into a perspective.
Sir?
It's really hard to put all those things, enigmatic issues, into a perspective. And looking back those almost 90 years of your life, how do you scale with your experiences in the Korean War and also devoted to commemorate the Korean War veterans' sacrifice and the Korean War as a history to learn? How do you put your personal life of 90 years into a perspective? Have you ever thought that you would be winding up working and fighting in the Korea and all those works that you've been doing after you come back from Korea?
No, I don't confront those ghosts, Professor Hahn, okay? I was a professional soldier, okay? When World War II ended, my soldiering didn't stop, that was what my life was. And when the Korean War started, I not only fully expected, but anticipated that I would be deployed there, because that's what my duty was as a soldier. And the thing that has made Korea different for me than World War II was this frustration of being unable to have the Korean War elevated to its appropriate place in American history. That it was that our conduct as a nation in that war was probably more honorable than our conduct as a nation in World War II. One could very justifiably say our participation in World War II was for self-preservation. Clearly, that was not a problem with the Korean War. There was no way that the American way of life, our governmental procedures, our whole concept of democracy was threatened by the Korean War, okay? So the fact that we as a people committed ourselves in that war was something for which we should justifiably be extremely proud. In our history, that has not happened. The Korean War, we have an expression, has fallen through the cracks. Mm-hmm. And that means this: in the olden days, the floors of our habitat were of pine boards, and there were gaps between the boards. So if you were to drop something, it would perhaps fall through the crack and be lost.
Fall through the crack.
So the Korean War, as far as American history is concerned, has fallen through the cracks. It is inconceivable that it's a 3-paragraph war in our history books. I mean, it's just inconceivable. And two of which are devoted to the Truman-MacArthur controversy. And you see, you can tell from my inability to really want to express myself that how frustrated I am, because it was everything we did as far as the Korean War is concerned exemplified what America is really all about. we were willing to sacrifice some of our youth to save another people, not being threatened ourselves.
The Korean War Veterans Digital Memorial Foundation launched the KWVYC Youth Corps in 2013, and your granddaughter, Dane Weber, was elected as president of this.
A fact of which I'm very proud.
And what do you think this one should do, and what is the role? I mean, what we are trying to do is two things: trying to train your descendants so that they can do more interviews and they learn from their own grandfathers. And also, one of the descendants of the Korean War veterans from Georgia, she is the history teacher in the high school. And she absolutely agreed with you, the incredibly short coverage of the Korean War in American history book. So what we are trying to do is to build this more material so that, first of all, the American teachers can have more materials directly from the Korean War veterans, built by the descendant of the Korean War veterans. Also, we want to propose that we have to cover much more on Korean War in the the history book. What do you want to tell them, and is there any way you think there will be the most reasonable way and realistic way to achieve those goals?
Well, we're at the point of the generation that fought the Korean War, where we are rapidly losing those men, those numbers. We're evaporating, okay? Our first generation children are men and women in their 50s and 60s today, who were not the same kind of beneficiaries of their parents of the Korean War as were their counterparts who were the beneficiaries of their parents of World War II. Because a veteran of World War II clearly was looked upon as a hero. And that aura of heroism was reflected in some respects on their first generation children. That's not true for the Korean veteran. That's lost in the American psyche. My children were not that involved. They were nowhere near involved as Dane is, okay, in the Korean War. Yeah, their daddy had, gotten hurt pretty badly there, but basically, when he came home, they had a normal life. We did things, we skied, we swam, we sailed, all that stuff, For them, it just didn't register because they couldn't relate anything in their history books to what their daddy had done. Okay, that differentiates from the World War II experience because they were confronted with it. Their dad was a hero. I mean, and justifiably so. But the Korean War veteran is not so looked upon. Okay, in American culture, that generation is not portrayed in our media as a generation of heroes. Yes, there are exceptions to the rule, but they're rare. And you went to Syracuse University, right? I don't know how much you were exposed to the Korean War there, unless it was deliberately so on your part. But I will almost guarantee you, without fear of being wrong, It wasn't heavy the curriculum for those undergraduate students at the same time you were there. I mean, I can't conceive that it was. I know, in the high schools today, American high schools, and I teach classes, in American high schools. They're guest lectures. They're not part of their official curriculum. They don't have a requirement to learn about the Korean War. Well, if they don't learn about it, they'll never begin to appreciate what it did and what it meant and what it demonstrated as far as what kind of a country we are. Your group, the Korean War Veterans Youth Group, I wish you so much success, but I don't know how you're going to generate the numbers to make a difference. Where do you get your people from? And they're there, my granddaughter's counterparts are all over the country. But reaching them and then motivating them is going to be a major effort. I would like to submit that if we were to get H.R. 318 passed and start publicizing, as a part of fundraising and what have you, that might engender some interest and get some publicity. But, I'll use a classic example. This past last year, July, the 60th anniversary of the ceasefire, okay. It was a non-event in American news media, except in Washington, D.C. Okay, that made the news there. One day, there were 10 minutes of stuff on TV. That's it. Nothing about the war. Mostly about the pontification of Obama and the other VIPs. Okay? They didn't even define the period of the war. And there's certainly, nobody brought up the ferocity of it. Nobody brought up, I don't want to. All I can say is this. If you paid very close attention to everything that happened on the 27th of July, 2013, you'd be hard-pressed to say that it was the bloodiest foreign war in terms of percentage of casualties America has ever fought. Why has that fallen through the cracks of American history? Because in American psychic and in American publicity and in American news media and in American school systems, it's not a big deal.